Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out when I'm sure that you were torn between staying outdoors and coming in to hear a lecture. It's good of you to come. I'm Brad Wilson. I'm Executive Director of the James Madison Program, the sponsor of this lecture. I want to welcome, first of all, our guest lecturer, Samuel Fleischacker, who I've been in correspondence with, and I'm deeply interested in his work, and I hope you will be too after you hear him speak. For those of you not familiar with the James Madison Program, we're a program dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you want to learn more about what we do, please visit our website, jmp.princeton.edu, and you can follow us on Twitter at Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our Friends newsletter, and that will get you announcements of all that we do. You can subscribe to our podcast, Madison's Notes, which comes out every other week, and learn more about all of our events, both our virtual ones and the ones where we meet in person. The lecture this evening is part of our Alpheus T. Mason lectures on constitutional law and political thought, The Quest for Freedom. It's entitled A Little Lower Than the Angels, What the American Founders Learned About Human Nature from Adam Smith. This lecture on the founders is brought to you courtesy of John Hansel, good friend of the Madison Program, class of 1946. He initiated this series, 20-some years ago as a tribute to his politics professor when he was here, Alpheus T. Mason, who is a predecessor of Professor Robbie George in the McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence here at Princeton. Mr. Hansel says it was from Professor Mason that he learned to respect the wisdom and foresight of the men who wrote the Constitution. Professor Fleischacker studied at Yale University. Nobody's perfect. Receiving his PhD in 1989. He works in moral and political philosophy, the history of morals and philosophy, and the philosophy of religion. Among the issues that have particularly interested him are the moral status of culture, the nature and history of liberalism, the relationship between moral philosophy and social science, and the relationship between moral and religious values. He has many books. I'll just mention a few of them, one relevant to today. On Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, a philosophical companion, which he did with Princeton University Press back in 2003. What is Enlightenment with Routledge in 2012. Being Me, Being You, Adam Smith and Empathy, University of Chicago, 2019. He's been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, here at Princeton with the Center for Human Values, and the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities at Edinburgh University. He previously taught at Williams College. I will leave it to him that I could describe his lecture, but I think I should just turn it over to Sam Fleischacker and let him do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brad. And thank you very much to the James Madison Program for inviting me here. As you'll see, it's a rather appropriate visit because a lot of this lecture will be about Madison. So it's kind of nice to be here to give it. Thank you to Christy for all her work in organizing this and helping me out with all the logistics, which was great. I'll just plunge in. The psalmist says, "You have made man a little lower than the angels." Madison says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He adds that since men and not angels are to govern men, every government must build within itself external and internal controls on the people who run it. And since Madison goes on to propose that these controls take the form of ways in which self-interest can check self-interest, ambition can be made to counteract ambition, as he puts it, he's often read as saying that human beings are a lot less than angelic, that we can't count on people to aspire to virtue at all, and must base our politics on the assumption that they always act on self-interest. There's a major theme in writing about the founders that at the time of the writing the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, they had basically given up on the idea that people could be virtuous and that politics could be based on virtue in the populace. This is a lesson that we only act on self-interest and politics must be based on self-interest, moreover, that he is thought to have learned from Adam Smith, among others. Insofar as Smith's influence on the founders is recognized at all these days, he's often thought, to his credit or discredit, depending on your point of view, to have encouraged the founders to recognize the pervasiveness of self-interest in our interactions with one another and to move accordingly away from a politics that relies on virtue, on integrity, public spirit, or concern for others, to a politics of self-interest, in which we can expect leaders only to serve their own interests and the populace to vote only on the basis of their self-interest. I think this is a misreading of both Smith and the founders, including Madison, and want to present a view today that emphasizes the word little in the quotation from the Psalms with which I began. If humankind ranks just a little lower than the angels, if we will never be perfectly virtuous, we need not conceive ourselves as wholly self-interested either. Human nature may be best understood as a balance between virtue and self-interest. We need accept the politics neither of a Plato or Savonarola or Rousseau aiming for communities or leaders fully driven by virtue, nor of a Hobbes or Mandeville or Bentham, assuming that people only act for their own interests. And that's exactly what Adam Smith taught, I believe, and exactly the view that, I believe, he bequeathed to such American admirers of his as Madison, Jefferson, and John Adams. I'll get to this thesis shortly, but let me start by talking about the evidence we have for Smith's influence on the American founders. Much has been written on the role that Smith's Scottish contemporaries, Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Thomas Reid especially, played in the thought of the American founders, but until quite recently, less attention has been paid to their reading of Smith. Yet there's clear evidence that many of them knew both his book on moral philosophy, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. There's even some reason to think that they may have been acquainted with his unpublished lectures on jurisprudence. Within a few years of its publication, The Theory of Moral Sentiments was warmly advertised in the New York Mercury, and it featured prominently in libraries and book catalogs throughout the late colonial period. John Witherspoon incorporated into his teaching at Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, of course. He'd brought a copy of it over for the Princeton Library when he emigrated from Scotland. Thomas Jefferson included it in a 1771 list of recommendations for a private library, and John Adams devoted a chapter of his discourse on Davila to a long excerpt from it. Wholesale, it just quotes the whole chapter, or most of the chapter. Benjamin Rush quoted it in the course of both the 1774 and a 1786 lecture, and James Wilson appears to have alluded to it in his 1790 to 1791 lectures on American law, which are the first major law lectures in America. Smith's lectures on jurisprudence were never published, and while it's possible that Witherspoon or Rush or Benjamin Franklin knew of them, both Rush and Franklin spent a good deal of time in Scotland, and Franklin knew Smith quite well. There's no direct evidence of this. Nonetheless, the content of these lectures may have had an impact on the founders by way of Lord Kames's historical law tracts. Kames sponsored and attended the first lectures Smith gave at Edinburgh in 1748-50, and is thought to have been deeply influenced by them. His historical law tracts include such Smithian theories of justice and resentment, the origin and development of property, the 4 stages of history, and the problems with entail and primogeniture that it's hard to resist the thought that he borrowed from Smith. So although Keynes's book was published in 1758, before Smith had published anything, and although Keynes never mentioned Smith in it, it may well have served as a conduit for Smith's jurisprudence. And the historical law tracts were owned at least by Jefferson, Madison, James Wilson, and John Adams. Wilson relied significantly on Keynes in his law lectures at the College of Philadelphia, and Jefferson copied large portions of the tracts into his commonplace book. These extracts include most of the Smithian sections in the law tracts, moreover, from the accounts of justice and property to the attacks on entail and primogeniture. It has indeed been suggested that Keynes's book informed Jefferson's drafting of a 1776 bill to ban entail in Virginia. Jefferson may thus have been impressed by Smithian ideas even before he read The Wealth of Nations. In any case, the fact that he and so many of the other founders were steeped in the jurisprudence of Keynes helps explain why they were immediately receptive to the similar views they found in The Wealth of Nations. The impact of The Wealth of Nations can be clearly shown. It's been found in 28% of American libraries in the period from 1777 to 1790, a larger number than owned Locke's two treatises or any work of Rousseau's except Emile. Thomas Pownell's 1780 Memorial on the American Conflict, which displays Smith's influence throughout and paraphrased several sections of The Wealth of Nations, had a profound effect on John Adams, who read it in the year it was published and summarized it in a letter to Congress. The financier Robert Morris owned a copy of The Wealth of Nations by the time of December 1781, when he lent it out to Edmund Randolph, who was a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress. While similarly a delegate to the Congress in 1783, Alexander Hamilton is said to have written an extended commentary on The Wealth of Nations. He certainly knew it well by the end of the decade, since he relied heavily upon it while also rejecting its central teaching in favor of economic nationalism in his 1791 report on manufactures. Madison put the book on his list of core items to be included in the proposed Congressional Library in 1783, and his cousin, the Bishop James Madison, who presided over William and Mary, incorporated it into the college curriculum in 1784. This is very early, by the way, for people to be taking an interest in The Wealth of Nations. It didn't really become a huge success until the 1790s in most countries. The Americans are, I believe, some of the first extended readers of the book, and that's probably not a coincidence, since much of the book is actually directed to America. Smith was very interested in what was going on in America. He never visited here, but he was interested in the conflict, and he was interested in the American economic structure. So possibly the founders found it interesting because it addressed them, or seemed to address them. James Wilson used the book to prepare for a speech on banking in 1783, and for his defense of the Bank of North America in 1785. Later, in a 1791 speech to Congress, Madison was to use Smith's authority to oppose banks. Noah Webster is said to have devoured the book in the spring of 1784. In 1785, he paraphrased Smith's analysis of the mentally debilitating effects of an advanced division of labor in his Sketches of American Policy. We find at least two explicit references to Smith in the debates over the Constitution. One supporter of the Constitution lists The Wealth of Nations as one of the great sources for political architects to consult. Another defender of the Constitution, writing under the name Civis Rusticus, cites Smith in support of the proposition that a standing army, judiciously controlled by a civilian government, need not endanger liberty. I find that last reference particularly interesting because we think today of Smith mostly in conjunction with free trade doctrines, but there's much else in the Wealth of Nations that was important and influential at the time, including, very controversially, his defense of standing armies, which among his friends in Scotland was heresy. You were supposed to support militias and oppose standing armies. He actually supported a standing army for actual fighting and a militia to raise people's courage, which is very much the structure we have in our Constitution. I think that's not a coincidence. He was also a very strong advocate of the separation of church and state, and as you'll see later on, I think that actually heavily influenced both Madison and Jefferson, who were, of course, already receptive to it. Smith, I've argued at length in the past that Madison alludes to the wealth of nations more than once in the Federalist Papers, although he doesn't mention Smith's name explicitly until 1791 in the speech on banking. In a 1789 speech, he does, however, explain the advantages of a very free system of commerce in terms obviously borrowed from the Wealth of Nations, and his House colleague Fisher Ames was well enough acquainted with the book to pick up the allusion. So without mentioning Smith's name, Ames immediately knew, oh, that's the Wealth of Nations. Finally, in 1790, Jefferson twice recommends the Wealth of Nations on lists he sends his relatives of basic reading material, calling it the best book extant on political economy. Okay, with that as background, I want to talk a little bit now about Smith and what's to be found in Smith's moral doctrines particularly. Though I move back and forth between the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, I don't believe there's a difference in his view of human nature. And then I'll return to the founders. So I'm moving now to the handout. A lot of the talk will be working through some of the quotations on the handout. The first quotation under section 2 here, self-love and virtue in Smith, is the most famous line Smith ever wrote, often the only line anyone knows about Smith. They see it in the economic textbooks and they don't see anything else. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, which proves every intro econ professor has told their students that Smith thought we were guided only by self-love, which is ridiculous even if you look at the quote. He doesn't say that we are everybody's motivated by their self-interest. He says when we talk to the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, we address ourselves to their self-interest. A, it doesn't say that the customer is self-interested, just that the butcher, the baker, and the brewer are. B, who would think you're going to walk into a butcher shop and say, please give me a piece of meat? I mean, maybe once in a while a person who's a beggar might do that, but most of us, we don't think twice about it. We just pay, right? So I don't actually think this proves much in any case, but if one were to wonder what Smith really think about self-interest, you have but to look to the theory of moral sentiments, where he has a long chapter criticizing, two long chapters, one criticizing Hobbes for his self-interest theory, one criticizing Mandeville for his self-interest theory, and then when he sums up his own view of virtue, this is quotation 4, he says, to feel much for others and little for ourselves, to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature. Not to indulge your selfish interests, but to restrain them. And then he has this lovely reading of the Golden Rule. As to love our neighbor as we love ourselves is the great law of Christianity, so it is the great precept of nature to love ourselves only as we love our neighbor, or what comes to the same thing as our neighbor is capable of loving us, which is to say, you shouldn't love yourself any more than somebody else might love you, and indeed not a friend or a lover, but a neighbor, a stranger, somebody you don't know very well. So obviously the lesson throughout is to restrain your self-interest, at least that's his moral ideal here. He seems to think throughout the theory of moral sentiments that that's possible. His famous device for that is the impartial spectator. He argues that as children we are judged by other people. Often they judge us in a way that shows bias, prejudice, partiality, or lack of information. To protect ourselves against that kind of misjudgment, as it were, he says we construct within ourselves a spectator, someone watching us, who is well-informed and who is impartial. And then we try to act in accordance with what we think an impartial spectator would say about ourselves. And the impartial spectator thereby serves as something like conscience. In fact, sometimes he uses the word conscience for it. But that's to say, our self-interest also should be governed by conscience. That's the kind of restraint that he's talking about in quotation 4 here. You should love yourself only as an impartial spectator would call on you to love yourself. That doesn't mean you shouldn't love yourself at all. Smith's teacher, Francis Hutcheson, Smith is a student of Francis Hutcheson, had argued that virtue consists solely in benevolence. Smith disagrees with that. He thinks a certain degree of self-care, caring for yourself, is not only inevitable. Hutcheson agreed with that, and Hutcheson also thought that self-interest was crucial in the economic realm, but he didn't think it was virtuous. You'll inevitably act in a self-interested way, but that isn't virtuous. Smith thought, no, actually, it's not virtuous to not care about yourself. Virtue requires that you care about yourself to a certain degree. And that allows for a fairly straightforward reading of why, for instance, suicide is immoral, letting yourself go to ruin is immoral, letting yourself become an addict, an alcoholic or a drug addict or something like that. This is inadequate self-care. And you see Smith's view about both self-care and caring for others, which are also come together in quotation 4. You see it spelled out in quotation 5, and also you see one of its sources. Smith is often thought of as a latter-day Stoic, and the Stoics were very concerned with care for oneself as well as care for others. So that this quotation puts together bits from several pages towards the end of the book, actually from a section that was added in the later edition, in which Smith talks about what are often called today the circles of sympathy. We could also call them the circles of care here. The first circle is yourself. Every man, as the Stoics used to say, is first and principally recommended to his own care, and every man is certainly fitter and abler to take care of himself than of any other person. That is, you are naturally inclined to take care of yourself, and that's appropriate because you know better how to do that than anybody else does. But after that, he says, you care about your family, and interestingly, he defines that not in blood terms, but in terms of people you live with who share the household with you. So that could include adopted family. It needn't be biological ties, stepchildren, step-parents, and so forth. And then further down, you'll see, he says, this is one of my favorite lines, I wish it were fully true, colleagues in office, partners in trade call one another brothers and frequently feel towards one another as if they really were so. The people you know at work, you feel like they're family, hopefully, some of the time, maybe for better and for worse. And then adds even the trifling circumstance of living in the same neighborhood as some effect of the same kind. So Smith thinks that we certainly do care for others, but to lesser and lesser degrees as you widen the circles. As far as family, even maybe your workplace, even maybe your neighborhood, he thinks the ties are quite strong. When you get to the entire country, he thinks that's the largest group you're effectively able to help, and he thinks you do care to some extent about all of your fellow citizens, but he thinks that that's a relatively weak kind of caring. Now that is important because the idea that what you should really be doing is caring for everyone in your country is what was called in the 18th century public spirit. And that's the kind of virtue that a lot of political theorists wanted to rely on in constructing a political system. That what you need is public spirit. Everybody ought to care about all of their fellow citizenry. That's especially associated with the figures that are called the civic republicans. Smith, I don't think, and most scholars of Smith don't think he completely rejected this idea, but he was skeptical about how strong it was. In any case, there's a famous line, and very, very famous line because it comes together with the invisible hand, which I've put as quotation 6 on the handout, in which he says about merchants, by pursuing his own interests, a merchant frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need be employed in dissuading them from it. One thing I find somewhat delightful about this particular quotation is that he had received a letter the year before, I think, from Edmund Burke, who was in Parliament, of course, and who said that, it's slipping my name. What's the name of the famous pottery guy from that period? Wedgwood, thank you. Josiah Wedgwood had been beseeching Parliament to do things to help his business, claiming that he was trading for the public good. And Burke says he doesn't trust anything he says. And I think that may have influenced Smith, or in any case, they were in agreement about this. Merchants who tell you tell the government especially, you should help us because we're really helping the country as a whole, don't believe what they say. That's the point of this line. It doesn't say nobody cares about the public good. It doesn't say legislators don't care about the public good. It doesn't say citizens don't. It says that when merchants claim that helping their business is good for the country, that is usually said in bad faith. So I do want to stress here the limited nature of this quotation. It is true that Smith doesn't rely on public spirit, certainly, to run his economic theory. He doesn't think people go into business in order to help the country or to help the world. They go into business out of self-interest. That's how the economic realm works. That doesn't mean the political realm works in the same way, and it certainly doesn't mean that personal relationships work in the same way. Again, you can tie this back to quotation 5. In terms of the close circles we have to our families, our businesses, our work partners, our friends and neighbors and so forth, we may feel very strongly benevolent towards them. We may sacrifice a good deal to help them. We're much less likely, it's not impossible, much less likely to do that for our country as a whole. That, I think, is the sense in which Smith is something of a skeptic about public spirit. So I want to note three things so far about Smith's notion of virtue, and then I'll add a fourth one that comes up on the next page. Number one, virtue consists not in indulging your self-interest, but in controlling it, and more generally in self-command, control of yourself, acting in accordance with the impartial spectator, which means controlling both your benevolent and your selfish feelings, but especially your selfish feelings. Secondly, virtue consists quite heavily in benevolence, caring for others, but largely for the people right around us, the people we're really close to, not for very large groups, let alone for anonymous society. And thirdly, there may be some level of public spirit, caring for the virtue in the sense of public spirit I don't think is ruled out by Smith. It's hard to find a place in which he positively speaks of it, but sometimes he talks of patriotism, and we'll see later on a quotation that does seem to assume that people are capable of public spirit, but it plays a relatively small role in his moral and political theory. The final point, this is quotation 7, is that virtue for Smith, as for Hume, and unlike many other figures of the time, isn't underwritten by religion. Now, all I've got here is a line in The Wealth of Nations in which Smith says, basically, governments shouldn't try to teach religion. A temporal sovereign, though he may be very well qualified for protecting, is seldom supposed to be so for instructing the people. This may seem a kind of a throwaway if you don't know that his teacher Hutcheson emphatically believed that governments should teach the existence of God, should teach the importance of God for morality. Hutcheson didn't say everybody had to be taught Christianity, but certainly had to be taught some kind of general natural religion. And Smith, who is very close to Hutcheson in most respects, rejects that. And I'll just note that Madison, who I think was explicitly influenced by Smith, as I said before, on the issue of separation of church and state, uses a line that is quite similar in his 1785 memorial and remonstrance against the bill introduced in Virginia to pay for teachers of Christianity, very much the issue that Smith was taking up. Madison says, the bill implies that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth. This is an arrogant pretension falsified by the contradictory opinions of rulers in all ages and throughout the world. The competent judge of religious truth, it really does look like he is influenced by Smith in saying this. And I won't go into detail on this now, but it's interesting that Madison, who had opposed government support for religion from the beginning of his political career, he had been involved in an amendment to a 1776 Virginia bill on the subject, in that bill, he doesn't make any reference when giving reasons for why the government should not be supporting religion. He doesn't make any reference to the incompetence of the government in teaching religion. 9 years later, he does. And in between, he had read The Wealth of Nations. There's also another bit from the memorial which I think relies on The Wealth of Nations. So I do think that The Wealth of Nations played some role, not so much in leading Madison to believe in the separation of church and state, but in giving him further arguments for it and support for his view on that. So importantly, Smith, like Madison here, and like some of the founders, not all of them, did not think religion was needed as an underpinning of morality. So virtue, on the one hand, involves constraint of your self-interest by way of the impartial spectator. Secondly, involves benevolence, especially to those nearest and dearest to you. Third, to some extent, may at least involve some care for your entire country, public spirit. This is still on, right? I feel as if the mic just went off. Okay. And fourth, is not dependent on religion. I think all of those factors play into the way the founders used Smith. All right. With these points about Smith and Smith's influence on the founding in the background, let's now look more closely at 3 examples of how the founders used Smith. I'll get back to Madison shortly. It's the main figure in my talk, and appropriately enough, as I mentioned. But let's first consider 2 other episodes in the career of Smith in post-revolutionary America. I begin with John Adams. In her recent terrific book, Adam Smith's America, Glory Liu tells us that Adams's wife Abigail, son John Quincy, and niece Lucy Cranch were reading Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments by 1786, and that John Adams told John Quincy in 1790 that both of Smith's books deserved his attention in a very high degree. In 1790, Adams also began himself writing a series of essays he called Discourses on Davila, which made extensive use of the theory of moral sentiments. One long chapter, as I mentioned, consists almost entirely of an excerpt from the theory of moral sentiments on the vanity of fame and power. Elsewhere, Adams paraphrases Smith. And now we can go back to the handout. I've given some excerpts, obviously not from the chapter which just quotes Smith, because that's not very interesting, but the paraphrases, I think, are. If you look at quotations 8 and 9, you have Smith saying, what is the end of avarice and ambition? Adams, what is the end of avarice? Smith says, is it to supply the necessity of nature, but the wages of the meanest labor can afford him food and clothing, the comfort of a house and of a family. Adams says even a poor person can get a shelter from the seasons and the comforts of a family. And then Smith answers his own question, why do we seek wealth, basically, by saying, to be observed, to be attended to, are all the advantages which we can propose to derive from wealth. It is the vanity, not the ease or the pleasure, which interests us. And Adams says, and these are his italics, his emphasis, not mine, we seek wealth because riches attract the attention, consideration, and congratulations of mankind. Adams was fascinated by the idea that we are constantly looking for other people's attention, that we are attention seekers. It is not because the rich have really more of ease or pleasure than the poor, and again, it's the similar kind of language. Further down from the same passage, Smith uses this point to indicate what's terrible about poverty. He said, and it's not so much not having your needs met, although of course that's important too. It's not being noticed, says Smith. And he says the poor man is ashamed of his poverty, and then stressed, though to be overlooked and to be disapproved of are things entirely different, yet as obscurity covers us from the daylight of honor and approbation, etc., not being attended to disappoints the most ardent desire of human nature. The poor man, this is a line that's often quoted, the poor man goes out and comes in unheeded, and when in the midst of a crowd is in the same obscurity as if shut up in his own hovel. And Adams doesn't quite quote this. Some of it's the same. The poor man is ashamed. He feels himself out of sight of others, groping in the dark. Beautiful metaphor, I think, which shows that he's cogitating about on Smith's words. He's turning them around and around and turning them into his own terms. Mankind take no notice of him in the midst of a crowd, at church, in the market, at a play. He's in as much obscurity as he would be in a garret or a cellar. He is not disapproved, censured, or reproached. He is only not seen. It could be said today. Young people like to talk about being seen. And Adams is already aware that being seen is crucial to who we are. And he is already concerned about the poor, that they are not seen. And already distinguishing between that and not being approved of. It's not that they're not approved of, it's that they're simply invisible. And that itself is a tragedy. I don't know many people at the time or later who brought this out. Writing on poverty doesn't tend to stress not being seen. So I think this is both a great insight. I think they're right, but also one that that hadn't been much talked about. Anyway, at the moment, although I think the his use of Smith and his elaboration of Smith is interesting, it shows how deeply he's interested in him. That's not really my point at the moment. Or what I want to stress is that what Adams takes from Smith is the idea that there's a delusion underlying our pursuit of wealth and fame and power, and that pursuit distracts us from our more proper attention to virtue and to the virtues of the poor. Smith makes clear that there's something deeply wrong with the fact that wealth and this is a quote from Smith, that wealth and greatness are often regarded with the respect and admiration which are due only to wisdom and virtue, and indeed describes our tendency to admire and almost to worship the rich and powerful and to despise or neglect the poor as the greatest and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. And Adams, this is quotation 13 on your handout, asks, what disgrace can there be in poverty? Is not the sense of propriety and the sense of merit as much connected with a full purse as with an empty one? Adams' point throughout the discourses on Davila, and the reason he brings Smith in, is to stress that we ought only to admire and seek virtue, but that we have strong natural tendencies to be misdirected towards seeking wealth and status instead. He wants us to be realistic about that, even while we try to overcome these tendencies. He doesn't think we ever can fully overcome them, but he still does hold out overcoming them as an ideal, something we should strive for. Liu argues that Adams was trying to warn his more optimistic contemporaries that they should not take for granted that democracy would automatically bring about an egalitarian ethos, that he used Smith, quote from Liu here, to articulate a chronic worry that he believed his contemporaries were ignoring. Our disposition to admire the rich and famous for Adams can lead us to institute oligarchy rather than democracy, seeking out wealthy rather than virtuous leaders. Don't think he was totally wrong about that. In any case, Adams clearly saw in Smith an ally for a powerful critique of wealth seeking, not an endorsement of it. Nothing could be further from the valorization of wealth-seeking and self-interest with which Smith is commonly associated today. So I think quite clearly Adams did not see in Smith somebody who was praising self-interest and its unrestricted pursuit, but he did see in Smith someone who is realistic about the limits of our ability to achieve virtue. It's not impossible, but it's tough, and there are things we need to look out for, and we can't expect ever to fully overcome them. So there's this anti-utopian streak in Smith, very strong anti-utopian streak that I think was important to Adams and I believe to Jefferson and Madison, especially to Madison. All right, let's turn to Jefferson, who described The Wealth of Nations, remember, as the best book extant on political and economy, and recommended The Theory of Moral Sentiments to his in-law Robert Skipwith. I think even Liu understates his affinity with Smith. While discussing John Taylor of Caroline, who's often associated with Jefferson in his political economy, she says that, quote, though many of his beliefs in the benefits of trade can be traced to Smith, Taylor was more of an embodiment of the Jeffersonian conviction that, quote, agriculture was the guardian of liberty as well as the mother of wealth. So on her telling, the Jeffersonians promoted agriculture in part as a source for certain civic virtues needed for liberty, while those who took their lead from Smith were supporters of commerce and manufacturing, which were widely seen as sources of corruption, the opposite of civic virtue, sources particularly of the loss of public spirit. But I think this way of describing Smith's place in the debates of the time is a mistake. In the first place, even as a purely economic matter, while Smith certainly criticized the physiocrats as well as the mercantilists, arguing that the market does a better job than governments in determining which sector of the economy will most help a country prosper, he's much less critical of the physiocrats than of the mercantilists, saying that their system, quote, is perhaps the nearest approximation to the truth that has yet been published upon the subject of political economy, and maintaining that in the natural course of things, every country develops its agricultural sector before turning to manufacturing and commerce. In the second place, Smith very much agrees with both Jefferson and John Taylor of Caroline, the agro-republicans, as Liu calls them, that agrarian work is better for our minds and our virtues than life in the city. Famously, he worries at the end of The Wealth of Nations about the danger that poor workers will get lost in cities and thereby lose the social support that helps people maintain virtue, as well as the danger that their minds will be constricted by the monotonous type of labor in which many of them will be employed. By contrast, he says this about agrarian labor, and now look at the bolded part of quotation 15, which I'll come back to the rest in a little bit when we talk about Madison. The common plowman, although generally regarded as the pattern of stupidity and ignorance, is seldom defective in his judgment and discretion. He's less accustomed indeed to social intercourse than the mechanic who lives in a town. His understanding, however, being accustomed to consider a greater variety of objects, is generally much superior to that of the other, whose whole attention from morning till night is commonly occupied in performing one or two very simple operations. So the point here is that the agricultural worker is more likely to keep his mind intact. It's not going to suffer from the mental mutilation that comes from life in the city, especially for a poor worker. So that's at least one kind of virtue that agrarian life might give. But if you look at quotation 14, you also see that Smith praises the independency of life in the country, the beauty of the country, the pleasures of a country life, etc., and the independency which it really affords have charms that more or less attract everybody. And if you look at the famous quotation from Jefferson from the Notes on Virginia in 16 on the handout, which begins with, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people," you'll see in the last line, one of the things that Jefferson stresses is that dependence begets subservience, and venality suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. What's great about agricultural life is independence, is that you don't depend on people as much as you do when you work, serve as a worker in an advanced division of labor. That's, I think, quite close to Smith. And in this sense, I think Smith certainly would support the idea that whether or not agriculture is that useful economically to a particular country, maybe in some circumstances and some stages of the division of labor, manufacturing and commerce is more useful, and the market will determine that. The agrarian life does provide certain civic virtues that are politically valuable. So in that sense, I think Jefferson is also reasonably similar to Smith. All right, now for the main attraction. And I hope I have enough time, but I think we'll at least be able to cover some of the points about Madison. So I've talked elsewhere about how Madison may have been influenced in 10th Federalists by Smith's argument for allowing lots of religious sects to flourish. When Madison talks about faction, he talks about how the factions will check one another, and that's very similar to what Smith says about religious sects. And indeed, Madison uses the checking of religious sects as a comparison point to what to his concern about factions. So I think there's some closeness there, and I've also talked. I mentioned already earlier that Smith and Madison seem quite close on church and state issues. And certainly they seem to agree about the importance of standing armies and of militias as playing a secondary role in the defense of a country, along with most of the founders. That's not what I want to talk about here. I have 4 points that I think provide an interesting comparison between Smith and Madison. The first is that Madison, like Smith, seems to believe that one's character can be shaped by the kind of work one does. So virtue, in this sense, can be shaped by the kind of work one does. If you look back now at the beginning of the quotation 15 on the handout, a famous passage from Smith is a build-up to his praise of the plowman. Smith says, "The man who works upon brass and iron works with instruments and upon materials of which the temper is always the same, or very nearly the same. But the man who plows the ground with a team of horses or oxen works with instruments of which the health, the strength, and temper are very different upon different occasions. The condition of the material which he works upon, too, is as variable as that of the instruments which he works with, and both require to be managed with much judgment and discretion." If you're working with animals all the time, you have to be sensitive to all kinds of subtle changes in the way they might behave day to day. That's not so true if you're working with metal implements. Hence, the common plowman, though generally regarded as the pattern of stupidity, actually has better judgment and discretion than the man who works in the city. Look at Madison from an essay he wrote for the National Gazette in 1792 on the life of the sailor. The condition to which, quotation 17 here, the condition to which the blessings of life are most denied is that of the sailor. His virtue at no time aided is continually exposed to every scene that can poison it. His mind, like his body, is imprisoned within the bark that transports him. Though traversing and circumnavigating the globe, he sees nothing but the same vague objects of nature. So again, there's a concern with seeing the same kinds of thing, and that becomes the same monotonous occurrences in ports and docks. And now, very directly, and at home in his vessel, what new ideas can shoot from the unvaried use of the ropes and the rudder, or from the society of comrades as ignorant as himself? So the idea that the materials you work on shape your mind, it's not an obvious idea, I think. That sounds very much like Smith. And the idea that we ought to be concerned about the labor people undergo or are employed by, not just because of how much money they're making or whether it's honorable or not, those are other, of course, important considerations, but because the very activity they're engaged with can shape who they are and can shape how they think. This is a thought that to some extent is associated with Marx maybe later on, but really wasn't very much explored until quite recently. And it seems that both Madison and Smith are concerned with it, and thereby concerned also not with just getting one's needs satisfied, with one's self-interest, but what kind of person one is, what kind of character one has. I noted also a similarity in the concern about what kind of society one has. Smith, in quotation 15, when talking about the plowman, does say, even though he praises the plowman, by the way, a famous line in Jefferson is one in which he says, state a moral case to a plowman and a professor. The plowman is more likely to answer it well than the professor. And I often wonder whether that too might have been influenced by Smith. But here in the middle of this, Smith acknowledges that the plowman is less accustomed indeed to social intercourse than the mechanic who lives in a town. So again, here, he's not talking about the materials you work on, but also the people you are interacting with. What kind of social life do you have? So Smith is very concerned with what you might call the micro level of how your life shapes who you are. Not just with, again, whether you're getting your needs and your desires satisfied, but how your activity shapes who you are. And that does seem to be a concern for Madison as well. All right, section 6 on the handout, page 4. Self-love and virtue in Madison. So, Federalist 10, which is often seen as relying on a self-interest conception of human beings, does indeed contain some lines which, taken out of context, suggest that. Quotation 19, as long as the connection subsists between man's reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have reciprocal influence on each other, and the former the self-love will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. Our ideas, our desires, our political views will be shaped by our self-love. Madison does say that. He doesn't back up from that. He does think it's inevitable, and it is an important factor in the rise of faction. And he also says, quotation 20, it is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust the clashing interests in a state. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. So that also suggests you can't rely on virtue to solve the problem, because you don't necessarily know if you're going to find virtuous people. That goes also with the angels not necessarily governing man. But even in quotation 20, he says enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. That suggests that sometimes they might be there. And in any case, if you go on to quotation 21, which reflects another aspect of Federalist 10, one of the things that Madison praises about the fact that the United States is going to be a large republic rather than a small one is that it is more likely that you'll be able to find people whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So one advantage of the large republic is precisely that it's more likely that we'll have some virtuous leaders. It isn't the only thing. The more famous solution to the problem of faction in Federalist 10 is that the different factions will check one another. Although he also adds even there, in a large republic, to coordinate your actions, you can't keep them secret. And it's embarrassing. It's likely to be humiliating if it's clear that you are acting for an unvirtuous cause. So even when he's talking about the ways in which factions will act on their self-interest, he is alive to the fact that factions, people who make up factions, are sensitive to the attention they're getting from other people. And in so doing, they are not only going to act on their self-interest, they will also at least try to be more virtuous. But in any case, he says quite explicitly that one part of the solution to the problem of faction is getting virtuous leaders. It's not the only part. Again, we come back to what I suggested was this quite commonsensical, realistic view of human nature that Smith has. We are never going to completely overcome self-interest, but you can't expect that you don't have to expect that people are always and only going to rely on their self-interest. There's a balance between virtue and self-interest in people's behavior. And again, quotation 22, more explicitly from now Federalist 57, Madison says quite explicitly, the aim of every political constitution, that is to say, including our own, the one he's defending, is or ought to be first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of society. So he's here talking about virtue in this sense that I identified earlier as public spirit, the sense that Smith seems, I think, to allow for. We'll come back to that a bit more in a moment, but doesn't think we have in any great measure. Madison does think we have some of it, and there are people who have patriotism and the kind of virtue which will lead them to pursue the common good. And explicitly, now from the speech in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, quotation 23, he says, I do not go on the ground that we're to place unlimited confidence in the legislators and expect nothing but the most exalted integrity and sublime virtue of them. The self-interested part. They're not going to be perfectly virtuous. They are a little lower than the angels, maybe a lot lower. But the next line, but I go on this great principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. There will be people of virtue and wisdom, and he relies on the principle that the people will want to select people of virtue and wisdom. I sometimes think he was overly optimistic here, but he certainly is optimistic. And then famously, is there no virtue among us? If not, we are in a wretched situation. All right, to wrap up now, two other points, rather interesting ones, I think. Section 7. Smith says in The Wealth of Nations, at one point, The legislature, were it possible that its deliberations could be always directed not by the clamorous importunity of partial interests, but by an extensive view of the general good, ought to be particularly careful neither to establish any new monopolies, nor to extend further those which are already established. So this is an interestingly cautious line. He clearly doesn't think that the legislature is always directed by an extensive view of the general good. Clearly thinks that it often is directed by a clamorous importunity of partial interest, that it is directed, that it does not act in a virtuous way, does not act with public spirit. On the other hand, why put in this at all unless he thinks that it can be directed by an extensive view of the general good? Smith's Wealth of Nations was read by very powerful people in England, including the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and many members of his cabinet. He probably knew that was going to happen. He was very well acquainted with these people. So it's hard to imagine that he would put this in if he didn't think it were possible that, yes, sometimes it can be directed by concern for the by an extensive view of the general good, and in that case, he's telling you what you would do if you're concerned by that. Concerned with that. So I think this is directed to the perhaps rare, but not non-existent, virtuous leaders that Smith is hoping for. I see a parallel, again, with Madison in Federalist 63, quotation 25, in which he defends the Senate. I think the 63 is generally directed to the Senate, partly because he says it can be necessary to defend the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. And towards the bottom, how salutary if the public is carried away by partial demands, by irregular passion. How salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. Once again, there is, if anything, an overly optimistic, certainly a strongly optimistic hope that Madison has that in general, at least very often, reason, justice, and truth can direct us, and that the Senate can help calm the passions of the society as a whole and direct it more towards reason and justice and truth in moments in which it's carried away by passion. So both Smith and Madison seem to think that it is at least possible for the legislature to correct for lack of virtue in the general, a lack of public spirit certainly, in the society at large. Finally, well, this actually, I said finally, but I have 2 points under 8. And one of them I'm sure of, the other I'm not sure of. Quotation 26 comes from almost the very end of The Wealth of Nations. You will often hear people say that the phrase impartial spectator doesn't show up in The Wealth of Nations. It does, but only once. And it shows up in this passage in which Smith says, curiously, that in all great countries which are united under one uniform government, the spirit of party, that is partiality, commonly prevails less in remote provinces than in the center of the empire. This might be a bit of a self-congratulatory note on the part of a man who lived in Scotland rather than London. But in general, he thought that the provinces can be a helpful corrective to the capital because the angriest passions will be in the capital. And he suggests that the distance of these provinces from the capital makes them enter less into the views of any of the contending parties and renders them more indifferent and impartial spectators of the conduct of all. That is, when you have some kind of partial movement that is tearing the country apart at its heart in the capital, the provinces might be able to help out, because they're likely to be more impartial. And Madison says in Federalist 43 that if you have something like a civil war between states, you have two states that are at odds with one another violently, in cases where you have two violent factions flying to arms and tearing a state to pieces, what could be a better umpire than the representatives of Confederate states not heated by the local flame? To the impartiality of judges, impartial spectators, Smith sometimes even uses the phrase impartial judge as a synonym for impartial spectators, they would unite the affection of friends. So he's suggesting, I don't think this has actually happened, but he's suggesting that states that are distant from a conflict within a given state, that if you have a state that is having a conflict of violent factions, states that are somewhat distant can serve as an impartial spectator to help calm the conflict. That again looks quite parallel to Smith, and it's an interesting suggestion as to how the idea of the need for an impartial judges could be instituted politically, could take a political form. And the final example of this is the one that I think is purely speculative on my part. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith says neutral nations are the only indifferent and impartial spectators of the conduct of one independent nation towards another. And Madison says, in doubtful cases, particularly where the national councils may be warped by some strong passion or momentary interest, the presumed or known opinion of the impartial world may be the best guide that can be followed. Both Smith and Madison seem to think that when there's too much partiality within our country, we should look to the judgment of the international community, which I think would not go over very well today, but who knows? Maybe there's something to it. The reason I am doubtful about the direction of influence here is that the quotation from Smith comes from the 1790 edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and Madison wrote the Federalist Papers before that. So he certainly didn't get it from Smith. It could be that they were thinking along similar lines. I, at one point, speculated that Smith could have read Madison, but I think that's very unlikely. Very unlikely that he was reading the Federalist Papers, being published in a New York newspaper. Still, it does suggest an uncanny confluence of minds, that they thought in similar ways. And that's basically what I'd like to suggest generally about Madison especially, and maybe about the founders more generally, especially Adams and Jefferson, which is to say, to sum up now, what you can get out of Smith, and what I think the founders did get, is not the importance of self-interest as opposed to virtue, but the importance of recognizing that while virtue is necessary, it's rather fragile and it can't always be counted on. That politics has to rely both on checking self-interest and on the hope and expectation that at times statesmen and voters will act in a virtuous way. I think Smith would have agreed with Madison that if there's no virtue among us, then we're in a wretched situation. We can't do without virtue altogether. But we can't expect, on the other hand, that people will ever be transformed into beings who fully care about one another and fully live up to the expectations of virtue. The hope both of Plato and even of John Stuart Mill, that at some point we could all be educated in such a way that we constantly care about the rest of humankind, let alone, or even the rest of our country. That's not a hope that either Smith or Madison entertained. Virtue is important, we should rely on it, but it's limited. So I think there's a kind of sober realism that Smith imparted to the founders. And finally, there's a naturalism about virtue. The founders who relied on Smith, and that's not all of them, but it certainly includes Adams and Jefferson and Madison and Noah Webster and Benjamin Rush, a little bit less so maybe. They did not think you needed to be a religious believer in order to be virtuous. Religion isn't necessary to underwrite virtue. Whether it plays a role, whether it's important otherwise, that's another question, and Smith certainly did think that there was some role for belief in God, and Rush certainly believed that Christianity enhanced virtue in a great way. But virtue could be counted on independently of religion, and I think what the founders saw in this, and I would say rightly, is that in a pluralistic, large society, this is something that I think they could already see, but they also anticipated, we must be able to count on some naturalistic kind of virtue. We can't expect that everybody will share the religious beliefs that would enable them to share the same kind of virtue. So I believe that the founders were profoundly influenced by Smith, especially Madison, but also many of the others, but that what they got from him was a very judicious and thoughtful and nuanced balance between the importance of self-interest and the importance of virtue in human nature, and not something that would lead them to reject virtue in the name of self-interest.
Well, thanks so much, Professor. We're going to open it up for some questions now. Now, we have a tradition in the Madison program to invite any students who are present to ask the first question. So are there students, and would you like to ask a question? You're not required to, and you can wait and hold it until later in the conversation if you prefer. Okay, let's open it up then. Anybody? Yes, sir. We're going to have a microphone for you.
Thank you for coming today. Very, very enlightening, the whole idea of virtue. So the question I have is, where do you see this expression of virtue occurring today? And along with that, can virtue be expressed concurrently through both the Democratic and Republican parties?
I think I could plead that this is outside the realm of my expertise.
There you go.
I'll say the following. Virtue has become a term that is associated largely with conservative politics, where it is generally understood to have to do with family values, and that's defined in a very specific way, and often with Christianity. I think that's a shame. I think it would be nice if people across the spectrum were talking about virtue in the sense that Smith and I think Madison were, in which it has to do with simply a very general concern both to restrain your self-interest. Remember that first quotation, as important as it is to love your neighbor as yourself, is to love yourself only as you love your neighbor, and with caring for those close to you, but also, at least to some extent, being concerned about the good of your society as a whole. There's more to it than that in Smith, certainly, and I think in Madison. But that conception of virtue, it seems to me, could be shared very nicely across the spectrum between left and right. But in fact, you don't hear very much about it. You don't hear about it on the libertarian right either, because there is a lot of the self-interest alone kind of politics. In fact, if anything, as you probably notice, my talk is directed against that. Let's just say I think this is a neglected resource.
Thanks, Sam. Professor Burns.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. Each of them will be short, but I hope that I'll have a chance to ask the second. The first is, in your very clear argument concerning the reliance of both Smith and some of the founders on self-interest and virtue. I was wondering what they're relying on it for.
What they're relying on him for?
What they're relying on those for.
Okay, that I could take that in several different directions. I think for Smith, certainly in the theory of moral sentiments, he is simply trying to build a conception of what human nature is, and then also make certain normative recommendations about what we should strive for, how what kind of moral education we should have, etc., in order to become perfected beings in order to become truly good human beings. He's not that concerned with politics. The founders are looking for a conception of human nature on which they can ground a republic. And that's not a trivial enterprise in a world in which generally countries are monarchies. And the idea that people can govern themselves isn't that widely held. So I think the question is, if people are fully self-interested, will a democracy work at all? And some people think, yes, the founders thought they were fully self-interested, but a democracy can work nevertheless because we can find ways for ambition to counteract ambition. And
Okay.
I'm saying that no, the founders didn't think, and I don't think they should have thought, that people were fully self-interested. It's not at all clear that democracy could work under those circumstances. They also thought that we needed a certain degree of virtue, although, let's say, a modest one.
Thanks. I guess within your answer, you were repeating a certain version of what's puzzling me. What's democracy for? If virtue and self-interest are for democracy, well, what's democracy for?
Well, there's
In other
several
words,
different
if I can
kinds.
just put the
Yeah.
point more sharply. The case for virtue, as it's made by the ancients, is not for something else. It's for virtue. And when it comes to be a means to something else, it's already corrupted. So in arguing that Madison, Jefferson, perhaps following Smith, look to both virtue and self-interest for the sake of something, that itself doesn't show any kind of affinity, it seems to me, to the ancients or to classical virtue. In fact, it shows a kind of a quiet corruption of the notion of virtue as something that is a means rather than an end.
Good. Okay, I see more what you're getting at. So I think Smith did think virtue was an end in itself, and I think that's what the theory of moral sentiments is about. And in that sense, I think he's quite close to the ancients, but I don't mean to say that either Smith or the founders should be just assimilated to the conceptions of virtue that you get in Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics. They were consciously in a different world, and there are certain presuppositions that they hold that would not have been held by the ancients, or at least certainly not by Plato and Aristotle, maybe more by the Stoics. So I don't, in any case, mean to say that they hold exactly the same notion of virtue that you're going to find in the ancient world. Now, that said, Madison and Jefferson and Adams are writing political papers, either to ground a republic or to convince people to adopt the republic. That's, of course, crucial to what Madison is doing, or in the case of Adams, to warn the republic of dangers that it may face. So their purpose is a political one, and it wouldn't be surprising. I don't know of any great systematic work of moral philosophy by any of these people, by any American of the time. So it wouldn't be surprising if when they talk about virtue, they talk about it in political terms, how it's relevant to the politics that they're defending. That said, I would push back a little bit. Plato talks about virtue as both useful and an end in itself, right? I mean, the premise, the setup of the Republic is, why should we seek virtue even if it isn't useful? And he takes that on as a challenge. Socrates takes that on as a challenge, right? But then he says, you've got to give me back what you borrowed from me. It is useful, right? And a part of his point is that virtue is both useful to you in terms of getting external goods as an individual, as well as something that's good in itself, and useful to the state as well as something that's good in itself. It achieves stability. It gives us all kinds of goods that we're looking for politically. So I don't know if this will hold throughout, and perhaps the Stoics particularly, this won't necessarily hold for. But I think for Plato, I wouldn't entirely agree with you that that he strips virtue of having any purpose beyond itself.
Other questions? I was thinking when you were speaking of the kind of prominence, wouldn't you say, in the founding because of the political purpose of civic virtue being what they usually mean when they speak about virtue. They're really speaking about certain character that is in fact compatible and in fact useful to republicanism. They're not thinking of something like, well, theoretical virtue, for example.
Well, that is certainly true in the quotations that I've been using, and again, that fits with the fact that they are making political arguments, right?
Yeah.
And they're talking about whether virtue is necessary for a republic. But in especially that quotation from Madison about the sailor, which comes from a little piece called The Republican Distribution of Citizens, I think his concern is not just with whether the sailor is going to be a good voter or not. He isn't obviously concerned with that at all. He's concerned with whether the sailor's life is good for the sailor as much as anything else. So yes, primarily they're talking about virtue as something that has a civic value, so civic virtue, which when people talk about civic virtue, usually what they mean is precisely what I call public spiritedness, although that I think that's not only what Madison and Jefferson mean by it. But yes, they are thinking about virtue as in civic terms.
So you're suggesting there's also, when they speak of virtue, in some contexts, they really are thinking of human flourishing, the flourishing of the human being. I
think so.
Yeah.
And they're reading Smith earlier for that purpose. I mean, it seems pretty clear that Madison was reading Smith with Witherspoon here at Princeton, or College of New Jersey. Yeah. And spending some time on it. And why would he be at that point? 1771, it's before there's any thought of a revolution from Britain and a new country here. Why would he be interested in a book like The Theory of Moral Sentiments? And that would be all the Smith that he had to read at that point, if he was just thinking about it in political terms.
Right.
So
it's probably why Hamilton didn't read The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
I don't think Hamilton's concerns go with this.
Yeah.
There's a reason I skipped Hamilton, besides learning that you were going to be here.
Yes, sir. Twofer. Sure. Wait for the microphone, please.
I have one more question. So everybody's thinking that this AI and chat GPT is going to be the end of the world and civilization. Is it possible to include in an algorithm virtuosity to really impact this new changing world we're entering into?
This is even worse. I can't possibly answer that. I don't think so. I'll just say that. We're all wrestling simply with the problem of how to have any hope that our students are going to be writing their own papers at the moment. And I did get a wonderful suggestion from a friend on that. I have them actually use ChatGPT to produce papers and then criticize those results. Though I have to say the few papers I got on that topic were not very good, but.
We have a tendency in the universities when we find an expert on something, we think he's an expert on everything. We want the answers. We want the answers now. Yes, sir, back there.
Thanks. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Andrew.
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to follow up on the previous question about virtue as an end in itself and as a useful means, especially in statecraft. So this paragraph or quotation number 6 on page 1 of your handout is interesting in that connection, because there it looks as though Smith is suggesting that in some sense self-love is to be promoted, at least in the merchant, because the virtuous merchant who's trying to do something for the public good often isn't quite as successful. So there it looks like there's a bit of a tension between promoting the end in itself that is virtue and promoting the good for the larger society. Is that just a sort of tragic tension that we have to leave there, or is there some kind of all things considered recommendation that we should give the merchant, especially if we're trying to build a republic of merchants?
Interesting. I mean, I'm tempted to go, at least in part, for the tragic tension. Smith has a lot of unpleasant things to say about merchants. Note that it's not that we actually have to foster self-interest in the merchant. Their claim to be acting on the basis of virtue is an affectation that's not very common among them and doesn't take much to dissuade them from it. So we don't have to actively go out and say, trade for your self-interest. But we can expect that they will. And one of Smith's other remarks about merchants at the end of Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations is that their economic interest is diametrically opposed to the good of the society as a whole, structurally, because they do best when a society is in a state of rapid change. Profit will go up most, a rapid change downwards as well as upwards. But they also are also cleverer than both workers and aristocrats, and therefore they are more likely to get the ear of the legislature pretending to be acting for the public good when actually they are structurally inclined to be acting against the public good. So that's a tragic tension. That is something seriously to worry about. He's not here talking about education that the society should undertake. When he does get to that at the end of the book, he mostly recommends reading, writing, and arithmetic for the poor. And he doesn't recommend moral education at all. He says that the Greeks indulged in had a great system of moral education, the Romans didn't, and the Romans had better morals than the Greeks. I think that's because he thought that we learn morality most from family and neighborly interactions. And I do think that's actually a central teaching of the theory of moral sentiments, one that's actually partly overlooked. But given his notion of virtue as something that arises from my looking at you, looking at me, agent-spectator interactions, he doesn't think that the kind of explicit education you get in schools, whether religiously based or not, is either likely to change who you are, so it's either needed or particularly helpful. So if you did want to inculcate virtue in the citizenry, you would have to go about it for Smith quite indirectly by encouraging family interactions, neighborhood associations, something like that. If you did that, I don't know that you'd have to expect. I think you could be optimistic that it would have some good effect, but I don't think he thinks there's too much we can do to change what people are like explicitly, consciously, rationally. It would be worse if they claimed to be acting for the public good. But also, maybe it would be worse if they actually ran their business for the public good. But that doesn't mean it would be worse if they, in their citizenly capacity, not their business capacity, were concerned about the public good, and in their private capacity were decent human beings. So it's very specifically in the context of commerce that he says, don't try to trade for the public good.
Okay. Pat, do you have a question?
Well, I did. Yes. You mentioned, I'm sorry. Yes, in section 9, to summarize, you said we're attention seekers, and that's the summary that I have. But then it says that if the virtuous will pursue the common good, okay? So does the common good corrupt the virtuous when they get to a certain point, let's say in political power, that they start out virtuous, but then pursuant to that, you know, they're corrupted or even tarnished.
So I don't think the common good could corrupt you, because almost by definition, part of virtue, not all of virtue, is a concern for the common good. That is the wider public good. As I've indicated, more local private goods are also crucial to virtue. Smith certainly thinks, and Adams agrees very strongly, that the more powerful and the more famous someone is, the more likely they're going to be corrupted by the search for yet more fame and more power. So the search, the fact that we seek other people's attention, the fact that we're attention seekers, on the one hand can make us better people. That makes you want to act well in the eyes of your family and friends. And that's a good thing. On the other hand, it can lead you to seek more and more attention, and then seek attention for its own sake, rather than seeking to become the kind of good person who deserves attention. That's Adams's concern in these passages from Discourse on Davila, and that's something he gets directly from Smith. Jefferson seemed to hope that once we had a democracy, we would create an egalitarian ethos such that everybody was seeking virtue and didn't care about things like fame and wealth. And the whole point of the Discourse on Davila is to warn people that that's not going to happen. We are going to continue to be people who are easily corrupted by the search for fame and wealth and power, and that's actually precisely what he gets from Smith. So yes, we can easily be corrupted, especially if we become prominent, but it's not by the common good, it's by the search for attention for its own sake.
Great. Anyone else? Well, okay, then please join me in thanking Professor Fleischacker.